So welcome everyone. Welcome to today's webinar about the 2022 Census of Agriculture. I'm Jennifer Dempsey. I'm the Director of American Farmland Trust Farmland Information Center, also a Senior Advisor with AFT. Before we get started, there are a few things we wanted you to know about the platform we're using today and also the session. We've muted webinar attendees, and you'll only see the panelists and their presentation during the session. The attendee control panel should be located on the right-hand side of your screen. There's an orange arrow that allows you to expand or collapse the panel. You can use the question feature in the control panel to submit questions and comments. You can keep that question pane visible while you're watching the presentation by clicking on that little square that's right next to the question heading. And that just decouples it from the control panel. You should also see a few handouts. We uploaded 3 highlight summaries from the 2022 Census of Agriculture. They're about producers, farm economics, and farms and farmland. Those resources are also available on the National Ag Statistics Service website, and they'll probably tell you about that near the end of the presentation. Next slide. So this is our agenda for the next hour. We're going to spend just a few minutes on introductions. We're going to ask 2 quick poll questions, and then we're going to hear from representatives from the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service, and they'll share results from the newly released 2022 Census of Agriculture. And then finally, we plan to leave about 15 minutes at the end of the session to answer some of your questions. So for those of you who don't know much about American Farmland Trust, AFT is a national nonprofit organization founded in 1980. Our mission is to save the land that sustains us. We do this by protecting farm and ranch land, promoting sound farming practices, and also working to keep farmers and ranchers on the land. Now, AFT's Farmland Information Center is a clearinghouse for resources about farmland protection and stewardship. We work to support people working to save agricultural land for agriculture. This includes ag landowners and practitioners. We do this by providing technical assistance. So we answer questions. We have an answer service. We do help connect practitioners, also landowners, with data from the Census of Agriculture, but also other relevant data sources. We develop educational resources, and we conduct policy research. Today, I'm joined by Kate Pontius and Ariel Lusser from the Farmland Information Center. We're hosting the event in partnership with AFT's National Agricultural Land Network. Our network expands the number and capacity of practitioners working to save farmland and ranch land. And the network also helps practitioners link farmland protection efforts with other objectives like improving soil health, increasing land access, and improving farm viability. We have Beth Frazier and Jamie Harrison from the network team, and they're running the webinar and also providing tech support throughout the session. And finally, we're very fortunate to be joined by Brian Combs and Virginia Harris, who are both with the Environmental, Economics, and Demographics branch with the Statistics Division at the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service. So they're going to highlight data about farms and ranches, the land they cover, some farm economic data, and producer demographics. We also ask them to touch on the history of the census and some data collection methods. And they'll share information about some of the upcoming resources. Next slide. So before we turn things over to Brian and Virginia, though, we're going to launch these poll questions. So Beth, you can go ahead now and launch that question. So first, we're interested to know which resources you've used from either the current Census of Ag, there aren't as many available yet, or the past Census of Agriculture. Just take a few seconds. You can choose more than one response. And then Beth, when you're ready, when it looks like a lot of folks have responded, you can just share the results. Wow, so it looks like a lot of you have been using the full census report, but even more have been tapping into Quick Stats, which is that online database where you can put together your own queries. So that's great. So now, Beth, I think we could turn to the next poll question. So next, we're wondering why you're using data from the Census of Agriculture. And again, you can select more than one response. The responses are some of the things that we've learned as people have asked us to help them tap into census data. Wow, so a lot of you are using it to understand the extent of US agriculture, land and farms, but also producer characteristics. You've been using a little bit of everything. So thank you for answering those questions. Now I'm going to hand it off to Brian and Virginia to begin their presentation.
All right, well, good afternoon, and Jen, thanks for having us today. We're excited to have the opportunity to highlight some of the high-level results from the 2022 Census of Agriculture this afternoon. So the data was released to the public at noon on February the 13th. At that time, NASS published over 6 million distinct data points. We have several million more that are scheduled to be released over the next few months. So given the magnitude of this data, we'll only be able to touch on a few high-level items and insights today, but we are excited to work with your team and all data users to further explore this valuable public resource. Next slide, please. So this briefing will offer a few remarks on the census data collection efforts. Then we'll dive into the farms, or the distribution and count of farms and ranches, and a look at the economics and some of the additional highlights and insights. I will then turn it over to my colleague to cover demographics of those involved with the farm decision making. We will conclude with a quick summary of a few additional products that will be made available following later this year. Next slide, please. Conducted once every 5 years, the census covers virtually every aspect of U.S. agriculture. It is a complete count of the nation's farms and ranches and the people who operate them. It looks at the land use, production practices, expenditures, and other factors that affect the way farmers do business and succeed in the 21st century. The first Census of Agriculture was conducted in 1840. The 2022 Census of Agriculture is the 30th in the series and the 6th conducted by NASS. The power of the census is its ability to visualize and understand important changes in agriculture at the U.S., state, and county level. Next slide, please. The 2022 Census of Agriculture had a response rate of 61%. This is down 10.8 percentage points from 2017. Response rates are highest in the Midwestern states and lowest in the Southeast and a few states in the western half of the country. Looking at the bar chart on the right, I would note that in 2022, NASS made a concerted effort to encourage responding via the web. While mail response is still the most common, web response was up 17 points from 2017. While response rates are down, NASS still received over 1 million responses to the Census of Agriculture. NASS continues to apply rigorous, accepted statistical practices and standards to the Census of Agriculture to account for all U.S. farms and the people who operate them. The Census of Agriculture methodology can be found within Appendix A. Next slide, please. As we walk through this presentation, it's important to keep in mind the definition of a farm. A farm is defined as any place from which $1,000 or more of agricultural products were produced and sold or would have been during the census year. The current farm definition was established in 1974. Now let's take a look at the number of farms and land and farms. Next slide. The number of farms at 1.9 million decreased 6.9% from 2017, or about 142,000 farms. This is a larger percent decrease than what has been seen in the past 20 years. Land and farms was also down 2.2%, or 20.1 million acres. This places the average farm size at 463 acres, which is 5% increase from the previous census. Next slide, please. Looking at the percentage change by state in farm numbers, most states, saw decreases in the majority of states. Most had declines greater than 5%. There were a few exceptions where farms did increase, such as Iowa, which increased slightly. Next slide. In the map, we can see how those 1.9 million farms are distributed across the country. For example, you can see the high concentration of farms in eastern Texas, north through the central US, and on the Pacific coast. Texas has more than twice as many farms as any other place, but it was also down from 2017 by approximately 18,000 farms. All states in the top 10 experienced declines in farm counts from 2017, except Iowa, which increased slightly. Next slide. Just like the decline in farms across the nation, the change in land and farms also decreased in most of the states. Most states were down 1 to 2% from the previous census. Next slide. The census allows us to view patterns of land use across the nation, both in terms of how much land is used for agriculture and how that land is used within agriculture. 39% of the nation's land area is devoted to agriculture. That percentage varies greatly by the state and county. Land use for agriculture is highest in the mid part of the US, with a swath of land from North Dakota moving south to Texas, where in many counties more than 70% of the land is used for agriculture. In terms of agricultural land use, permanent pasture and cropland are the two major uses, with under 400 million acres each. There were 301 million acres of harvested cropland in 2022, and woodland and other uses added just over 100 million acres to round out the total. Next slide. Before moving into the details of this slide, I would like to note that not all large farms in terms of acreage translate into large farms in terms of value of production. For example, greenhouse nurseries or livestock operations may have a small number of acres, but have a large value of production. The 2022 census shows decreases in the number of farms in all land size classes except the 5,000 plus acre class. Farms with less than 50 acres decreased 6%, or about 55,000 farms, while farms with 50 to 500 acres decreased 7%, or approximately 61,000 farms from 2017. Next slide. On the left, we showed those same farm numbers by size of farm from the previous slide. On the right, those same classes are tied to land and farms. You'll notice that the 5,000 plus acre class of farms control 42% of the land and farms in 2022. This group's influence has seen a continuous increase over the last 20 years, increasing 7 percentage points over that period. Next slide. The census allows us to view patterns of land tenure across the nation. About 61% of the land is owned by the farming operation. 39% of land is rented. As you can see in the map, the share of land rented from others varies greatly by region, with the higher share of land rented in the Midwest, along the Mississippi Delta, and in California and areas along the East Coast. Next slide. Now we will turn our attention to the farm economics and focus on the economic measures from the census looking at value of production, crop and livestock sales, and farm income. As we all know, weather conditions and economic factors can affect farming operations, the volume of commodities available for sale, and prices received for those commodities. These factors can affect the sales category from which a farm falls into for a particular census year. I will also note that dollars in the census are nominal or not adjusted for inflation. In 2022, the western half of the country suffered from long-term drought, while extreme weather events impacted the Midwest and Southeast. Prices for major field crops and livestock were up substantially between 2017 and 2022. Corn, soybeans, wheat, broilers, and milk all had near record high monthly prices during 2022, while avian influenza impacted the poultry sector, driving up prices, especially for table eggs. Next slide. The number of farms with over $1 million in sales has been steadily increasing, while the other classes have held steady or decreased. 6% of farms in 2022 were in the $1 million plus class compared to 4% in 2017. Next slide. Like the slide we saw a few minutes ago, this slide displays the farm count by value of sales. The right panel shows the magnitude of contributions from farms with $1 million or more in sales were to the total value of production. In fact, more than 75% of the $543 billion in total value comes from farms with greater than $1 million in sales. Those 105,000 farms represent less than 6% of the total U.S. farms. The share of sales coming from farms with a value of production greater than $1 million increased from 69% in 2017 to 78% in 2022. In terms of value of production, California remains, next slide. In terms of value of production, California remains the top agricultural state with over 11% of the value. The top 10 states contributed to 55% of the total value of production in 2022. Most states saw value of production up over 30% from 2017, and half of the states had increases of more than $2 billion. Next slide. Looking at the total value of production at the county level, we see that the value of production is certainly not spread equally across the country. For instance, you can easily see the impact of cattle feeding in the high plains of Texas, or the cluster of poultry production in southwest Missouri and northwest Arkansas. The table on the right identifies the top 10 counties in terms of value of production. The first 9 of those are in California. In fact, Fresno County has a higher value of agricultural production than 23 individual U.S. states. Fruit, tree nuts, and berries were the primary commodity categories contributing to those values, with the exception of Monterey and Imperial counties, whose largest value came from vegetables, and milk, which led the way in Merced County. Next slide. In this stacked bar graph, we can see that the total value of production increased substantially from 2017 to 2022, up almost 40%. This was largely driven by near record high prices for many crop and livestock items during 2022. Next slide. Taking a deeper look at the value of crop production by category, we see that grains and oilseeds led at just under $169 billion. Total crop sales in 2022 were $281 billion, up 45% from 2017. Most of this increase was due to large increases in the price of grains and oilseeds, which were up 58%. All other categories also showed increases. The table on the right indicates the leading state and its contribution to the total value of production for that category. For example, Iowa contributed 14% of the grains and oilseeds. There were no changes in the top 10 states from each category from 2017. Next slide. Looking at the same slide for livestock, we see that total livestock sales were up 35% at $263 billion in 2022. All livestock categories showed increases in the value. The largest increase was for poultry and eggs, up 56%. Texas, North Carolina, California, and Iowa led the way in the livestock categories of cattle, poultry, milk, and hogs and pigs. There were a few changes to the top 10 states for livestock. North Carolina replaced Georgia for poultry and eggs. Washington replaced Mississippi for aquaculture. And Texas replaced Colorado for sheep and goats. Next slide, please. Looking at how we got from 2017 to 2022 in terms of value of production and which commodities contributed to the increase, we broke apart the grains and oilseeds category to show the top 10 commodities with the largest impact. If you take a look at cattle, for example, it was $89.4 billion in 2022, which was up $12.2 billion from 2017. The largest increase was for corn at $37.3 billion. Moving across, you can see that there are only increases, no decreases in the top 10 commodities. This is unusual. Typically, there are some increases and some decreases. The table on the right shows the actual total value of production for each of those top 10 items. Next slide, please. We can now turn our attention to the other side of the ledger and take a look at farm production expenditures. Expenditures also increased from 2017, up $98 billion. The largest two expenses for farms are feed and livestock purchase. The livestock purchase includes both breeding and non-breeding animals. The largest changes in expenses from 2017 include an increase of $25.7 billion for feed and $12.6 billion increase for fertilizer. Again, we only saw increases in expense categories, no decreases. Next slide. The past few slides, we discussed the total value of agricultural products and farm production expenditure. The census also collects data on receipts from government payments and farm-related income. These data allow for the calculation of net income at multiple levels of aggregation, including state, county, and congressional districts. At the U.S. level, all income categories showed large uncharacteristic changes between census years. Between 2017 and 2022, net farm income increased by $36.7 billion. The average net farm income of $79,790 was up 85% from the previous census. So this wraps up the majority of the information regarding farm economics. I think we do have one more slide. Next slide. It shows the net farm income of producers. So this wouldn't be farm, this would be the actual producers, which takes out those value of those items and only shares the farmer share of that they receive from production contracts. Primarily. If you'll notice here, it's not equally spread once you break those out by the farm specialization. So that $79,000 average net farm income is a pretty big dispersion there based on the actual industry. You notice the higher net farm income for the dairy cows and the other categories. So, next slide, please. So USDA has been investing heavily in broadband and high-speed internet access. The census captures internet access on farm by type of access. Overall, internet access has increased from 75% to 79%. Generally, internet access rates were higher in the western and northern states. The chart on the right details the percentage of those with access by the type of connection. Farms may have multiple forms of internet connection. Respondents were asked to report all that applied. There was a large increase in mobile access, moving from 39% in 2017 to 62% in 2022. There are a few more insights and interesting facts in the census. I do encourage you to go out and explore the full Census of Agriculture on the NASS website. A few additional items include, next slide, over 116,000 farms sold directly to consumers with sales totaling over $3 billion. Over 60,000 farms sold directly to retail outlets and institutions with sales of $14 billion. 38% of acres used no-till practices. This was up 1.1 percentage points from 2017. 27% of acres used conventional tillage practices. This was down 1.7 percentage points from 2017. 18 million acres were planted to cover crop. That was up 2.6 million acres from 2017. Farms with renewable energy production were up 15%. Solar panels accounted for 76% of the renewable energy producing systems on farms. This was the first census which hemp is listed as an individual crop. Additional highlights on hemp will be released later this fall. Next slide, please. Okay, and to recap here, farm numbers and land and farms have both declined. There continues to be more of the largest farms. Fewer farms account for most agricultural products sold, and there was an increase in internet access, especially via mobile. I will now turn it over to my colleague, Virginia Harris, to cover demographics of farm producers. So, Ginger?
Thanks, Brian. So Brian has talked to you about the general structure and economics of agricultural production. I'm going to focus on a slightly different aspect of the census, which is looking at the demographics of people who produce those products. This is one of the unique items from the census, as it gives us a snapshot of those involved with farming and ranching. The graphical data is highlighted is for a farm producer, and just as a brief explanation, a farm producer is someone who is involved in decision making for the farming operation. For most of the information I'm presenting, the data is collected for up to 4 producers per farm. Next slide. Now let's look at farm structure in terms of who is farming. And we'll also look at the number of producers. Again, the census collects data for multiple people per farm. While the number of farms declined about 6.9%, the number of producers declined only about 0.8%, which is a much smaller change compared to the decrease in the number of farms. This is due to a larger number of farms reporting multiple producers. Farms reporting just 1 or 2 producers declined in number, while the number of farms reporting 3 or more producers increased. 60% of all farms in the US reported more than 1 person involved in the farm decision making. Next slide. So the average age of farm producers is a long-running data series in the Census of Agriculture. It receives a lot of attention each census cycle. From the map on the left, you can see that the average age of all producers at the county level. Average age varies a lot across the country, with, in general, older producers in the Southeast and the Southwest, and younger producers in the Midwest. The table on the right highlights the average age over the last 20 years as measured in the census. You will notice that average age increased by about 1 year per census cycle. From 2017 to 2022, the average age increased about 0.6 years, which is smaller than the previous trend of increases. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about a few demographic groups from which we gain an understanding from the Census of Agriculture. On this slide, we're going to look at young producers. That's a group of farmers who were under 35 as of December 31st of the census year. The map of young producers looks somewhat like the inverse of the map of average age. So we see a higher concentration of younger producers in the northern US, in the Midwest, and in the Northeast. Overall, about 9% of producers are considered young. One important thing to note is young producers may be running their own farm, or they may be operating a farm with other producers. You can also see from the table on the right that the averages in terms of both dollars and acres are larger for farms with young producers than they are for farms overall. Next slide. Here's another glimpse at that structure chart you saw earlier. So as we said, the number of all producers was down 0.8% from 2017. You can see, however, how that looked for farmers by age, where we actually saw an increase in the number of young producers. That age group of those under 35 increased by about 4%. The number of producers aged 35 to 64 was down about 9%. And the age of the older farmers, the number of older farmers, those 65 and older, increased about 12%. One of the things you might be wondering is, when you look at young producers, is who they're farming with. So we didn't publish that directly in the census, but we can get some hints of who those younger farmers are. One of the things we know is that young producers are much less likely to farm alone compared to all producers. Only 17% of young producers are farming by themselves, compared to 40% of all producers. You can see their young producers are more likely to be on farms with 3 or more producers compared to producers overall. So I told you, and if we move to the next slide, we can see those change in the number of producers, young producers by state. You can see, as we noted from the last slide, the number of young producers was up about 4% compared to 2017. And now you can look at that at the state level. You can see a large number of states had increases in young producers, particularly concentrated, say, in the Midwest, in the Northeast, in particular. Those are the states that saw, young producers increasing the most. Next slide. We can also look at how those young producers were engaged in decision-making on the farm, and particularly compare that to decision-making from farmers in the middle age groups as well as the older producers. You can see young producers are more likely than other age groups to make decisions regarding livestock, but on average, young producers participated in fewer decisions than older producers. Next slide. One of the ways you can look at farms by demographics groups is to look at their farm specializations. The census data assigns a unique NAICS code to each farm operation, which shows what type of commodity the farm specializes in. This is determined by the commodity category, which generates at least 50% of farm sales. This commodity specialization is unique for each farm. And in this chart, you can look and compare the commodity specialization for farms with young producers compared to specializations for farms with no young producers. For example, you can see grain and oilseeds are much more likely to have a young producer than, say, other crop farms. And you can see that the share of farms involved in beef cattle ranching and farming is about the same across the two groups, farms with young producers versus farms with no young producers. While the number of producers who have cattle feedlots are involved in dairy, cattle production, hog production, poultry production are small in terms of the overall number of farms, those are farms that are more likely to have a young producer as well. Next slide. Now we can look at new and beginning producers using, in general, the same set of slides that we saw for young producers. A new and beginning producer is defined as anyone who has operated any farm for 10 years or less, which would include the census year. About 30% of all producers are new and beginning, and 33% of all farms have a new or beginning producer. You can see from the table on the right that not all new and beginning producers are young. The average age of a new and beginning producer was 47.1 years old, lower than the overall average of 58.1, but not exactly young. The number of new and beginning producers is a number that's increased since the previous census, where it's up about 11% compared to the overall decrease of farms at 6.9%. So that's one of the things the census showed us is new and beginning producers increased in terms of overall numbers, while the number of producers overall decreased. Let's move on to the next slide. You can also see from this table that farms with new and beginning producers are overall smaller in terms of farm size than producers overall. The next group is another slide that's showing you farm structure. You can see, again, new and beginning producers are less likely to be on solo operated farms, more likely to be on farms with multiple producers. Let's move on to the next slide, which is a similar map to you saw for young producers, where it shows the states that experience an increase in the number of farms with a new and beginning producer. Again, somewhat similar patterns to the maps we saw for young producers, where the number of new and beginning producer operated farms are higher in the northern United States. What does a new and beginning producer farm look like? If we go on to the next slide, we can look at farms by economic class. You can see that new and beginning producers, this is that light green bar, are more likely to operate small farms compared to farms overall, and much less likely to operate a farm with over $50,000 in sales and government payments. If we move on to the next slide, we can look at beginning producers by farm size class. This would be in terms of the acres operated. Again, new and beginning producers, the majority of new and beginning producers are on farms with less than 50 acres. That's more than the share of producers overall. What do new and beginning producers specialize in? Well, one of the things is if we look at if you can go to the next slide, we can look and see, we said there was an increase in new and beginning producers. We might like to see the farm type of the farms where new and beginning producers increased. You can see, for example, there are more new and beginning producers engaged in oil and grain seed farming, and some of the livestock specialty operations, and like farms overall, the number of beef cattle farms decreased in number. Let's move on to the next slide, which is the same slide, but for farmers with military service. We know that many people are interested in how veterans participate in agriculture. Overall, about 9% of farms have a producer with military service. The average age of a producer with military service is 68 years old, so much older than average for all farms. The number of farms with military service decreased 18% from the previous census. I'm going to go quickly over the next few slides in this presentation. So we really have a lot of information we want to share, but we know we also want to have time for questions and answers. So I'm just going to maybe show you one or two more slides focusing on changes in numbers of farms operated by producers of different races and ethnicities. The Census of Agriculture collects data both on race and ethnicity. The census uses the categories identified by the Office of Management and Budget for federal statistical agencies, which specify that race and ethnicity are separate concepts. Producers who identify as Hispanic can be of any race. Producers may also select multiple race categories. It's important to understand that 95% of producers in the US are white, though you can't see them in the chart above, which included only those who reported a race or ethnicity other than white for scalability in the graphic. So you can see the chart on the left is for the number of farms, while the chart on the right is for the number of producers. Both show similar trends. The number of farms with producers of Asian and Native Hawaiian origin increased in number, while the number of farms with Hispanic, American Indian, and Black producers decreased. And the same is basically true for each of the producer numbers. So let's skip the next couple of slides. If we can go to the slide that shows you some upcoming census products. How about we go 2 more slides? We know we've released a lot of information. What we showed you was just the barest glimpse of data points released from the Census of Agriculture. We released 6 million data points, but we have many more to come. We'll soon be publishing, actually, it looks like we publish tomorrow, our state and county profiles, which include the information already published, but are as a profile for each state and county in the United States. Later in May, we'll publish congressional district profiles and rankings. And in late June, we will publish data, more detailed data on statistics for those by race, ethnicity, and gender. We have another of other tabulation, census tabulations coming this year. You can see on this slide. We will also be accepting requests for special tabulations starting in August, and you can provide more information about, you can find more information about that on our website. Again, this is just what Brian and I talked about today. It's just a small glimpse into all the data available from the census. You know, the census has data for, you know, the nation as a whole, which is what we focused on today. But there's also, you know, lots of this, if it's published at the national level, it's published at the state level. And then there's a lot of data available at the county level as well. And with that, I think we're open to questions from the audience, and I will send it back to our friends at AFT to talk about how they want to do this question and answer period.
Yeah, thank you. That was really great, Brian and Virginia. We appreciate that overview. So what we're going to do is we received some questions when people registered for the webinar, and then others were posting them as the webinar was progressing. So we're going to look through those. We're imagining that we may not be able to get to all of the questions, so our plan will be that we'll answer them and send them out as part of the follow-up to the webinar, and that will happen later this week along with the recording. But in the meantime, just to get us started, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the 5-year census cycle and help people understand that, you know, this is a year ending in 4. You've released the results for the 2022 census, but you may already be starting planning for the next one, and what sort of goes into that, and in particular, when folks would have an opportunity to provide some input on the next census.
Hey, sure, Jen, it's a great question, and it really is a 5-year census never really ends. We finish, and actually the week after we released, we began working on and planning for our content for the 2027 census. So that was a very timely question. We are anticipating a little later this spring, early summer, that we'll actually have a Federal Register notice out, and people will be able to start sending in suggestions for content changes, new questions, those type things that we'll then be evaluating and determining what will be, in the content of that 2027 census. I will say a lot of the value of the census is the kind of stability of questions over a period of time, so you can really measure those structural changes in agriculture. But we're always looking for adding new things. As I mentioned, hemp was included this time. We had some questions on precision ag that were new to this census. So always kind of taking into account those items that are changing across the country to get them incorporated.
Okay. I'm wondering if you can expand a tiny bit about how you make decisions about which data items to include. When you're getting all of these suggestions, then you have certain data items that, as you said, you want to be able to track over time. So how do you balance requests from all the different groups that I'm sure you're receiving?
Yeah, that's a tough one to do. There are limited pages and space available in the census. We have to take into account our producers' ability to answer questions. We typically evaluate all requests that come in to determine the feasibility of including those. In some cases, we need to do some cognitive testing with producers to see if they can even appropriately answer the question to get to the data that's needed. We look to USDA programs a lot to see how those questions can help support or inform what's going on there. And then, as I mentioned, a lot of the history of the census data sets is real, or the value is really that long history. So before we disrupt a data set, we want to make sure that any change we make kind of supports those historic trends and the ability to track those from previous census cycles.
Mm-hmm. And there is a question we received about including additional sort of producer behavioral questions. And so are there certain subject areas that maybe are more outside the purview of NASS or your authorities? So is that something you could add if somebody was suggesting it, or is that a different branch of USDA better suited to someone else? Or is that in the scope of NASS, could be included?
I would say it's potentially in the scope of NASS. I don't know that the census is maybe the most appropriate for that, but we do have plenty of other annual programs and specialty products kind of possibly a follow-on to the census. Some of our annual programs that might be better suited to collect. One of the challenges with some of those type questions is the census is primarily self-administered, meaning most of that data comes back either through the mail or, as I mentioned, we saw that increased web response. So when we get into some topics, it's better that we can actually have a trained professional either via phone or face-to-face to enumerate those questions to get more of what data item we're actually trying to collect from the producer.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about efforts to build the census list, the list of producers who receive the census?
Sure. So we tried to cast a very wide net. So to count the 1.9 million farms that we counted this time, we mailed out over 3 million census forms. So we usually tell producers, hey, if you get this or you're in doubt, fill it out. Let us evaluate to determine if you are a farm or not. We partner with many organizations to gather list of known producers that they may like to share with us so that we can be sure and have them counted. We also maintain on an ongoing basis a list of known agricultural producers across the country that we're constantly updating through our annual programs and a lot of these list sources that are shared from partners that we have.
Okay. So there's a question about whether the census includes information about non-operating agricultural landowners.
So I'll let Brian expand more. We're currently we're planning to do a survey on land ownership. The previous incarnation was called Total, which does have information about non-operating landlords. The census, in fact, does not measure it. It does talk about farmers who rent out at least some of their farmland, but non-operating landlords is covered by a census follow-on, typically conducted every 10 years, depending on NASS budget and what is, congressional appropriations. I don't know if Brian wanted to add anything more.
Yeah, no, I think you noted. I was just going to just remind folks that the census is collecting data on farms, so they have to qualify as a farm, meeting that $1,000 of sales or potential for $1,000 to be counted there. So those non-operating landlords likely would not qualify.
We have a question actually about the that definition of a farm. And is that something that NASS has control over, or is that set by Congress, or how does that definition of farm, do you have control over that? And has it changed over time?
Say it has changed over time. If you go back and look at earlier censuses prior to 1974, which is when the current definition was set, there were some various thresholds in there. That $1,000 is a pretty low bar. There was some direction from Congress that NASS stick with that $1,000 of sales category. So we haven't had any indication of anyone requesting that we change that in the interim. There have been some discussions, but no real push or nod from Congress that we should be moving in a different direction. So we've been pretty consistent with that $1,000 of sales.
Okay. Now there are some questions about land use. So many of the people that AFT works with are interested in the conversion of agricultural land to non-farm uses. So can you speak a little bit about declines in land and farms and what we can get from that information versus other data sources?
Right. So the census doesn't actually capture what that land is going to. So even if it went out of farming, that's basically the only thing that we know about that, but not actually what other use that may be used for now. It could be that maybe if it was something like pasture, the particular producer didn't have animals at that time, but they may have those in the future, and that may be then again counted as farmland, but the census just does not capture where the land went to and what other use it was being used for.
Right, and NASS may also have some other data sources that maybe provide more insight. For example, NASS produces something called the Cropland Data Layer, which is a satellite-derived image across the United States of what is grown on different parcels of different pixels of land. So your practitioners might be interested looking at the Cropland Data Layer, which is another NASS product, and it's produced annually. So that is another way of looking at land use over time.
Okay, great. Another land use question we have is the other category and what falls into that category.
You can take that. So basically it's what the respondent considers as other. Some of the things we've talked about would be land used as, if you're a poultry operation or a hog operation, land and buildings that are related to the farming operation, land and ponds, sort of wasteland. So it would be basically land that's not cropland, land that's not pasture land, and land that's not woodland. But it is as the respondent reported that. But there are indications on the report form of what's supposed to be included. For example, if they live on the farm, their house and, you know, that area around their house would be in other land and buildings, warehouses, ponds, roads, etc.
Folks noticed that there was an increase in that other land category this time as other parts of land and farms went down. Has there been any analysis or any thought about causes of that, or is it just what was reported by producers?
We have not looked at that specific data item very closely.
Okay.
It's a relatively small share. It looks like it was up a couple million acres. One of the things to do would be just to look at that at the county and, you know, state level to see where those changes were. So on our table, we say it's, and I'll give you a more complete definition. It says it's land and farmsteads, homes, buildings, livestock facilities, ponds, roads, wasteland, etc. But again, it is sort of a catch-all category. And it is, you know, what the respondents reported would be the best description of what it is.
Okay, thank you. Now, does the census track the acreage of public lands leased by ranch businesses?
That the land use under, you know, animal use land under AUM land is not included in the census. So those public lands are excluded from the census land and farms.
Okay. Let's see. Can you tell us, Ginger O'Brien, if there were any significant changes in data items and or published tables this time around that would affect comparability of data over time?
So this time around, we're pretty comparable with 2017. I guess there would be one thing you will notice about the demographic data tables is we've published only numbers for all producers. You know, prior to 2017, we collected data for a principal operator and then 2 other operators on the farm. Starting in 2017, we collected data for 4 persons, and then in a single question said, you know, tell us if you're a principal operator, but that was sort of defined by the respondent. It wasn't clear that it was always, you know, a meaningful distinction. So we've decided to publish data just for the all producers, anyone involved in decision making. So we've dropped all the principal producer items and tables from the census.
Okay. Can you explain the difference between, and I'm not even sure what the correct label is it total producers and then all producers, meaning up to 4 per farm?
Right. So I believe
difference that you see in some tables,
right,
that I know confuses people.
So there is, like if you would look at some of our cost tab tables. So if you look in quick stats, producers all is we ask a global question at the beginning of the producer characteristics section, saying how many people are involved in farm decision making. Basically, and to say how many men and how many women are involved in those decisions. And then we say report up to 4 people per farm. So the global question about men, women, and the total number of men and women is the producers all in quick stats. And then the total producers would be the up to 4 persons per farm.
Okay. I think we have time for maybe one more question. And again, any of the unanswered questions that we received, we'll make an effort to answer them. We'll share with NASS to make sure we're on the right track, get their help if we need it, and then we'll send those responses out along with the recording. So there's a final question about whether there's any NASS research that is tracking farmer rancher use of public land, which I think you had actually talked about a little bit already, is that, but I'll let you speak to that.
Not that I'm aware of. I mean,
Okay. So I think we are right at 3 o'clock. And we thank Virginia and Brian, thank you so much for sharing all of this information with us, but also your expertise. We really appreciate you being with us today. And for attendees, we will be following up with the recording, some information about AFT Farmland Information Center resources, and then answers to all of the questions that we didn't get to. So thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks for inviting us today.
well, thanks for the invitation. And yeah, I think you'll share our contact information if anyone wants to contact us if they have more questions.
We
or
will.
need help finding data.
Yes. Yeah, we will. Thank you.